Part 8 of Rebels of the Red Planet by Charles Louis Fontenay. Read by Mark Nelson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Rebels of the Red Planet 15. Dark walked across the desert toward the Canfell hydroponic farm. He had discarded the marsuit he had been wearing, and substituted for it a light loincloth torn from one of Goat Hennessy's sheets. This reverse reaction, in a temperature that would be uncomfortably chilly for a fully clothed man and descended far below zero at night, resulted from his recognition that he gained a tremendously greater direct influx of energy from the total exposure of his skin to the sunlight. He could feel the energy penetrating his flesh, building up in him, and with this energy the low temperature did not bother him. Behind him, by a rope, he dragged a little two-wheeled cart he had constructed from ground-car parts. It rolled and bumped over the sandy terrain, containing all the Mars-suits and all the 7 heat guns he had been able to find at Ultravirus. It also contained a supply of water in cans. Dark had found that, while he was operating directly on solar energy, he did not need food at all, and he did not need as much water as he did under ordinary circumstances. He probably could have survived 2 weeks without any water at all, but some water did make him much more efficient. His independence of food and oxygen did not prevent the slow desiccation of his tissues in the dry Martian air. As he walked, only part of his mind was devoted to the routine task of moving across the desert. The remainder of it was free of the limitation of distance, touching and interacting with the minds of 3 other men. These men were members of the Phoenix. At the Childress Barber College they had been among the instructors, struggling to develop the ESP potentials of their students so that a psychic community of purpose and action might be developed toward the goal of teleporting materials from Earth to Mars. These were the men whose ability at telepathy and psychokinesis had been most fully developed, to the point of practical demonstration. Now, newly aware of the extent of his own inner powers, Dark had conceived a bold plan of action, to which these men's comparable abilities was a necessary contribution. There were 3 of them: Mantar Phalusane at Hesperidum, Pietro Corellani at Mars City, and Cheng-I Kan at Ophir. Among them, by a vast, intangible network of communication, they discussed strategy and the situation on which it was based. Mantar: "We knew of the existence of the Canfell hydroponic farm. It was on our charts as a Marscorp industry supported by the government. But we thought it was only an industry, producing food. We did not know it was an experimental center." Cheng: "We did not know Marscorp was conducting genetic experiments at all, except those of Goat Hennessy. We kept a casual observation on Goat's work. Our intention was that, if he ever succeeded completely in what he was trying to do, we would make a fast raid with a task force, and appropriate his work to our own purposes." Dark chuckled. Dark: "That would have dismayed Marscorp. But it appears that, as things have developed, this sort of raid must be directed now at the Canfell hydroponic farm, to free my father and the Marscorp slaves there. Old Beard is, after all, the real leader of the Phoenix. If we succeed in kidnapping Goat, we can put him to work for us, but that is not the primary objective." Pietro: "Do you plan to take over the Canfell hydroponic farm and make it our base of operation?" Dark: "No. When we attack the farm, they will radio Mars City for help, and we don't possess the force to fight off an all-out government counterattack. I have been in communication with a Martian friend, Krill, and I am informed that the domes in the Icaria Desert, which were used by the original rebels a quarter of a century ago, are still usable, although they will have to be supplied with oxygen, food, and water. I intend for the Phoenix to congregate there, and utilize the help of the Martians in carrying out the embryonic changes which will make your children and mine as I am. A new race, capable of living in the natural Martian environment." Pietro: Will these characteristics of which you speak be inherited, or must the embryonic changes be made in each generation? Dark. They will be inherited, because they are changes of the genetic structure. The changes will have to be made on each individual embryo of your children, but their children will be born with these qualities naturally. Cheng. What are your instructions? Dark. How many Phoenix are at each of your places? Cheng. 12 at Ophir. Mantar. I would have to count. About twice that many at Hesperidum. Pietro. About 75 here, as well as the wives of most of the Phoenix who are married. Dark. 75? That's more than we had in school. Pietro. Don't forget that the school was there for a long time before you came, and it had many graduates. The government captured between a third and a half of us who were in the school at that time, but there are still probably 300 to 400 Phoenix scattered about Mars. Dark. Where are the other 3 instructors, whom I was unable to contact with this telepathic call? Pietro. They are at Cherax, Nuba, and Ismenius. Their telepathic powers are not as well developed as ours, and they would not hear you unless they were expecting the call. Dark. Cheng, I thought your group was to go to Regina. Cheng. It was, but the Regina airlocks were more effectively blockaded to us than at the other cities. Those who went to the other cities, except those who were caught, had identification establishing them as legitimate residents of those cities. Regina has a peculiar social structure, which makes this virtually impossible, except for the Phoenix who are already there and have been there for a long time. We thought of stopping at Zur, but there were no arrangements to care for us there. We went to a dome farm operated by a friend of the Phoenix in Pandora Freedom, and stayed there until we could trickle gradually into Ophir. Dark. You had quite an odyssey. Cheng, I want you to bring your 12 in ground cars, with what weapons you can get, and attack the Canfell hydroponic farm. I'll try to break it open from the inside. Pietro. Shall I bring my group from Mars City as reinforcements? Dark. No, 12 will be enough, and the conquest of the farm will depend on speed. Before you can get there with your group by ground car, the government will have a well-armed force there by jet. I want you to load trucks with supplies, gather all the wives, and go straight to the Icaria Desert to establish our colony. I'll direct you telepathically when you reach Icaria, if we aren't already there. Cut across the deserts and lowlands, and stay away from the roads and cities. Pietro. Very well. But we'll have to leave the city vehicle by vehicle, and rendezvous somewhere in the lowland. It will take some time. Dark. Whatever is necessary. Do you know where the chief is? Pietro. He's here in jail, in Mars City. His trial is due in 20 days, and we had planned to rescue him sometime during the trial. Dark. Leave a few good men there to rescue him as soon as you've cleared Mars City and are on the way to Icaria. Has Newell Eli gotten back to Mars City yet? Pietro. I don't know. We can find out. Dark. He has Maya Kara Nome with him. She's the girl who was the secretary at the Barber College when it was raided, and she's one of the Phoenix now. I want her rescued. At the same time, if possible. If not, I'll go to Mars City and do it myself later, but I want to get all of you cleared of the city first. Mantar. What do you want me to do? Dark. The most difficult thing of all. I want you to stay in Hesperidum, and send out all the Phoenix you have with you to contact those in other Martian cities. They are to rendezvous at Hesperidum, and then you will gather supplies and form another caravan to join the rest of us in Icaria. Cheng. When shall I move out? Dark. As soon as you can gather your men and material together, but stay out of sight of the farm and don't attack until you hear from me. I should be there within the next 48 hours. The instructions given, the telepathic conference faded out, and Dark was a solitary man plodding across the desert, pulling a loaded cart behind him. He came in sight of the Canfell hydroponic farm in just about the time that he had predicted to Cheng, but waited until nightfall to approach it. Phobos was abroad in the east at sunset, so Dark waited a little longer, until the nearer moon plunged beneath the eastern horizon. Deimos was not in the sky this night, and Phobos' disappearance left it near pitch dark. Dark moved across the starlit desert, pulling his cart to the walls of the farm. The farm was not a massive, sprawling fortress like Ultravirus, because most of it was underground. The upper floor, in which Happy's masters lived and worked, was just below the ground level, and the underground vats were below it, extending considerably beyond it in all directions. The only parts of the farm that projected above ground were its 4 entrances, small buildings of white stone, each with its own airlock. Dark went through the airlock of the nearest one. These entrance buildings were the barracks of the toughs, in which they slept at night, secure from the possibility of escape, because no marsuits were available to them. Dark had moved quietly through a barracks of sleeping toughs the night he had left the farm for Ultravirus, but this time he had his cart with him. There was no alternative but a bold course. Spearing the light of an electric torch before him, he walked down the aisle toward the barred gate leading into the regions below, pulling the metal-wheeled cart across the stone floor behind him. On all sides of him arose an angry growling and shouting, an upsurge from the many throats of the animal noises that were the tough's nearest approach to human language. Dark moved forward steadily, keeping a telepathic radar out to warn him of any impending attack. The very boldness of his action paid off. Its openness apparently convinced the toughs that this was merely another unusually noisy case of one of the masters returning to the farm at night, as Dark sensed had occurred often before. Dark was not molested. The barred gate had no controls on this side. Dark operated it psychokinetically. It raised slowly. He pulled his cart through, and he lowered it behind him and went on down the ramp into the underground cavern. He went straight to Old Beard's hiding place and awoke him. Old Beard greeted him joyously. "I was afraid something had happened to you, you were gone so long," said Old Beard. "I had to walk back," said Dark. "None of the ground cars at Ultravirus was in operating condition." "Then there's no chance of the rest of us escaping," said Old Beard disappointedly. "We can't get at the ground cars here, and the marsuits you brought won't help. The oxygen supply of a marsuit isn't adequate to take us from here to the nearest civilization." "I think we can get to the ground cars," answered Dark confidently. "I brought heat guns, as well as marsuits. Besides, I have a larger plan now than merely escape." He related to Old Beard all the things that had happened, including the fact that Old Beard was his father. "I am very happy," said Old Beard simply, tears in his pale eyes. "I liked you very much from the start, Dark, and I'm glad that you can bear the name of Dark Kensington rightfully." When Dark told him of the plan for the conquest of the farm, Old Beard stroked his beard thoughtfully. "I'm afraid that the attack from within will depend largely on you and me, although Shadow probably will be able to help effectively," said Old Beard. "The jellies aren't very aggressive, and even with a few heat guns, I'm afraid they won't be of much use." "How about the toughs?" "The toughs would be fine, if you want to wipe out all the masters and all the jellies, and possibly us too. They're vicious and unintelligent, and they can't be disciplined or depended upon." "With the attack from the outside timed right, I think the 3 of us can handle it," said Dark. "How many of the masters are here?" "Only 10," answered Old Beard. "And they aren't soldiers, but scientists. But they do have weapons, and they know how to handle them. They have to, in order to keep the toughs from getting out of line." "Perhaps we can whip the jellies up to the point of causing a good deal of initial trouble and confusion, and then the 3 of us move in at the proper moment after the attack from outside is under way," said Dark. "We might even turn the toughs loose on them without weapons." Old Beard gave him a steady gaze from beneath his bushy eyebrows. "I don't think we want to use the toughs," he said slowly. "I said there are 10 masters, and that is correct, but they have a visitor who arrived by copter several days ago. A visitor and a prisoner." "A prisoner?" "Yes, a prisoner who wasn't sent down to the vats, but is kept on the upper floor. This prisoner is a black-haired, black-eyed woman." "Maya!" "Yes, I think the visitor is Newell Ely, and the prisoner is your friend, Maya." 16. Newell Ely sat with Placer Viceroy, director of the Canfell Hydroponic Farm, in its large, underground dining room, eating lunch. This meal was not the tasteless, gelatin-like food that was fed to the jellies and tufts and sold on the Martian market. It was a meal of thick, juicy steaks from the dome farms around Hesperitum, and vegetables from gardens inside Mars City Dome. "We've been here better than a week, and she's still stubborn," Newell said morosely. "Surely she has the intelligence to realize how ridiculous and impractical is her sudden conversion to a lost rebel cause. I'm half convinced that this Kensington fellow put her under some sort of hypnotic spell." "You've been very gentle in your methods of conversion," said Placer. "It isn't like you, Newell. If you want quick results, we could turn her over to the toughs for a while." "No, I don't want her hurt. I love the woman and intend to marry her. The whippings and humiliations are as far as I'm willing to go." "A peculiar sort of love, if you don't mind my saying so," remarked Placer. Newell stared at him coldly. "I do mind your saying so," he said. "My personal emotions are not subject to your interpretation. But Martian wives are expected to obey their husbands, with deference, and, by Saturn, I'm going to break her of that liberal terrestrial training." "You'd have the legal right to take the steps necessary for that, if she were married to you," Placer pointed out. "But the little fool refuses to marry me now!" exclaimed Newell in exasperation. "If she hadn't refused, do you think I'd have brought her here? But I couldn't take her to one of the cities, except as a prisoner, to be tried for sedition and treason, as long as she expresses this violent and open support of the rebel cause. Whether you consider it love or not, I want the woman for myself. I don't want her imprisoned or executed." "Perhaps if she were presented with that alternative she'd be more reasonable about it," murmured Placer. "Don't you think I've threatened her with it? She just says that she'd rather die or go to prison than go back on her convictions and knuckle under to me. If she could only forget that she'd ever met that man Kensington." "Well, as for that, it might not be so hard to arrange," suggested Placer quietly. Newell stared at him. "What do you mean?" he asked. "You're not familiar with the details of our work here, are you, Newell?" "I thought I was, pretty well, but what you just said doesn't strike a chord." "As you know, the toughs and jellies are originally criminals and vagabonds you have smuggled to us for experimental purposes. One major effect of our initial glandular experiments with them, which makes them into toughs and jellies, is that they lose all memory of their past." "I don't want a flabby woman like a jelly!" exclaimed Newell with a shudder. "I think we could eliminate the memory, permanently, without any physical changes at all," said Placer. "There are some pretty good scientists here. I expect the operation would cut down her thinking ability pretty heavily, though. I think it would still be slightly higher than that of the jellies, but you couldn't ever expect her again to get above the intellectual level of a child of 6 or 8 terrestrial years." "I don't care anything about an intelligent woman," answered Newell ruthlessly. "If she weren't so proud of her intelligence now, I wouldn't have so much trouble with her. I want her as a beautiful woman, which is all a woman has a right to expect from a man, and if she were less intelligent and more tractable, I might be able to train her to become the sort of wife a man of my profession and position requires." Placer speared a bit of steak casually with his fork. "Any time you say the word," he said carelessly. "I'll give her the rest of today," said Newell with decision. "I'll work her over again with the whip this afternoon, and if she doesn't break, I'll tell her what she can expect. Then, if that doesn't do the trick, I'll turn her over to you the first thing tomorrow." "Tonight would be better," suggested Placer. "The initial surgery takes only about 30 minutes, and she'd do better to rest a night after that. It alone will remove a great deal of her volitional power. The entire series of operations will require about 3 days." "Tonight it is, then," said Newell, "if she doesn't break this afternoon." Maya sat in her locked room, her tunic and trousers covering the red welts on her back and legs. The tasteless gelatin which had been her only food since their arrival almost gagged her with every spoonful, but she had eaten all her lunch. She needed all the strength she could get to maintain her defiance. She was in the grip of dull, unrelenting pain, physically and emotionally. Her flesh ached from yesterday's beating, and she was sick at heart at the revelation of Newell's essential brutality and callousness. She had thought him a sensitive and intelligent man, and she had admired him for this, even after some of his exhibitions of childish temper had disillusioned her as to the glowing nobility which she had at first attributed to him. She had felt a warm attraction to him, and, when she thought Dark was dead, she had been willing to marry him, on the basis, not of the passionate love she now felt for Dark, but of a mellow tenderness which she conceived a sound basis for an understanding life together. But now she shuddered at the thought that she might have married him, and perhaps lived all her life with him, thinking him to be gentle and kind. Whatever happened to her, she felt fortunate that this crisis had brought to her view the hidden side of him, that heretofore had been seen only by his partners in political manipulation and by the unfortunate victims of his prosecution. Her shoulders drooped wearily. She stared across the room. It was as bare as a prison cell, which, intrinsically, it was. There was a glass on the wash-basin. It was made of heavy metal, with no sharp edges. Did Newell think she would commit suicide? Not as long as she knew Dark was alive. Her mind touched the glass. It quivered. It tilted and fell to the floor with a clang. She looked at it with mild curiosity as it rolled into a corner. She hadn't done that for a long time, not since she suppressed it because of Newell's hatred of witchcraft. It was telekinesis. She had had the power since she was a child. It seemed that she remembered using it often, and in rather startling ways, when she was a small child with the Martians. But when she went to Earth, she gradually stopped playing with it, except in small ways when she was alone, because it seemed to make her elders very uncomfortable. Telekinesis was ESP. It did not mean that she had any other ESP powers, but there was her experience in the copter. Her mind reached out. At once, like a shock, she was in contact with Dark. His mind turned to hers at once. Dark. "Maya, where are you?" Maya. "Come into my room, darling. I'm at the Canfell hydroponic farm. Are you still at Ultravirus?" Dark. "No, I'm in the vats below you. I knew you were here, but I didn't know where. I can see your room now, though, and its place in the building." Maya. "Can you free me?" Dark. "Not now. There are 4 toughs outside your door guarding it. I can't attack them without arousing the masters. Soon, though." Maya. "I don't know how I'm doing this. I didn't know I had telepathic powers." Dark. "A good many people have them, potentially. They don't have to have been changed as I was, but they usually require development." Maya. "I'm just glad I can, to know that you're here." Dark. "Maya, why are you in pain?" Maya. "Newell has been whipping me, to try to get me to recant on my expressions of support for the rebel cause." There was a white-hot explosion in her brain that almost literally seared her mind. Staggered at its impact, She recognized it as the explosion of dark, sudden anger. Then she was no longer in contact with him. 100 feet away, in another room, Newell pulled on a pair of black gloves and picked up a short, thick-lashed whip. Coiling the whip, he stepped out into the corridor and turned toward Maya's room. He met Placer, walking in the opposite direction. "You're going to make your last try now?" asked Placer. "Yes," replied Newell. "I hope it works. Actually, her spirit and quick wit are among the reasons I like the girl. But I don't intend to be defied in this." He proceeded on down the hall. As he started past the barred gate to one of the ramps leading down into the vats below, the buzzer beside it sounded. A jelly was standing behind the gate, fat, pathetic face pressed against the bars. Newell stopped. No one else was in sight in the corridor. "What do you want?" he asked the jelly.
"Master, I seek entry in answer to the summons," replied the jelly in a voice that quavered with fright.
"What summons?"
"It was ordered that one of us come above and do a task for the masters," replied the jelly. "I am one of those who must work today, and I have come in answer to the summons."
Newell looked up and down the corridor. He saw no one. "What sort of task?" he asked, reluctant to accept the responsibility of admitting the jelly.
"I don't know, master."
"Look," said Newell, "I'm not a master. I don't know anything about the summons. Someone else will have to let you in."
"If I'm late, they'll let the toughs whip me," wailed the jelly pathetically. "Please let me in, master."
Newell, the whip coiled in his hand, impatient to get to Maya's room, was moved to pity at the creature's plight. Besides, the jellies were harmless, and this one certainly wouldn't be seeking admittance without having been called. "All right, then," said Newell, and flipped the switch. The bars grated open, and the jelly came into the corridor. But as Newell reached out to activate the switch and close the gate, the jelly, with surprising agility, slipped between him and the switch. "What in space?" growled Newell. "Get out of the way!" The jelly did not move. "I said, get out of the way!" snapped Newell, shaking out the whip. The jelly cringed, and his eyes were terrified, but it still stood against the switch, its huge, translucent body barring Newell.
"No, master," it whimpered. "Don't shut the gate."
Viciously, Newell slashed the whip across its naked shoulders, and the jelly squealed with pain. Newell raised the whip again. But then, through the open gate, there poured a solid mass of translucent flesh, a horde of naked jellies. Silently, they tumbled into the corridor, filling it from wall to wall, and others behind them pushed to enter as they paused. Wide-eyed, Newell stared at them for the briefest of moments. Then he dropped the whip and fled back up the hall, shouting at the top of his voice. The door at the end of the corridor opened as Newell neared it, and Placer appeared in it. He held up a restraining hand. "Don't make so much noise," he snapped. "There's a conference going on in there. What's the—" Voiceless now, Newell grasped Placer's arm and pointed, trembling, back down the corridor. "What in space?" demanded Placer irritably, peering at the mass of jellies pouring out of the gate and beginning to move hesitantly along the corridor in both directions. "Jellies!" croaked Newell. "The jellies are loose! They're attacking us!" "Soft hunks of blubber," said Placer contemptuously. "They can't hurt anybody. I wonder what idiot left that gate open." "I did," admitted Newell. "I mean, one of them wanted in, and I let him in, and then he backed up against the switch so I couldn't close it, until the others came in." "I don't know what sort of harebrained idea has gotten into their feeble minds," said Placer, "but I can take care of it in short order." He stepped back into the room, and Newell heard him apologizing to the others for the disturbance. Then Placer reappeared, 2 whips in his hand, and closed the door behind him. He handed one of the whips to Newell. "They're a lot more tractable than that woman of yours," said Placer. "Let's go." Placer moved down the corridor toward the slowly advancing jellies, and Newell followed reluctantly, at a respectable distance. "Get back below!" shouted Placer at the jellies as he neared them. "You know better than to come up here without permission." They stopped and milled as he approached them relentlessly, those in front trying to hold back and those behind them pushing them on. Placer moved straight up to them and began slashing right and left with his whip. There was a sudden surge forward of the jellies, and Placer was engulfed. He vanished in a mass of seething, translucent flesh. Newell stopped, appalled, and began to edge backward. There was a flurry of movement in the forefront of the jellies, and Placer burst out of the group, his hair awry, his clothing torn, his whip gone. He staggered toward Newell at a half-run. "Get back to the room!" cried Placer. "I don't know what stirred them up, but they can't be frightened back with whips." The two men ran back down the corridor and burst through the door, startling a conference group of 5 of the other masters. "Heat guns!" snapped Placer. "Something stirred the jellies up, and they're up here causing trouble. I'll turn the toughs loose on them." While 2 of the others hurried out another door for weapons, and a third bolted the door through which the 2 men had just come, Placer picked up a microphone and switched on the amplifier system that covered every area of all levels of the Canfell hydroponic farm. Into the microphone he gave an animal call, a cry that started out on a low crooning note and rose in volume and intensity until it hurt the ears. He repeated this 3 times. Then he set the microphone down and turned back to his colleagues, an expression of satisfaction on his face. "That releases the toughs," he said. "Every tough in the place is free to maim or kill any jelly he sees, without fear of restraint or punishment. That should bring them to heel pretty quickly." End of Chapter 16.